So it's lovely to meet all of you. My name's Lawrence Knight. I work for the BBC, where I'm a radio producer, and I have made a few programs about psychedelic research and psychedelic psychotherapy. With me, I have George Goldsmith, who is the co-founder, chairman, and chief executive of Compass Pathways, which is a company which is leading the global research effort to get regulatory approval for the use of psilocybin in the treatment of depression, amongst other mental health disorders. I have on my right a man who needs no introduction to most of you, I expect, as David Nutt, Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College in London, and a huge name in the field of psychedelic research. He's also a former chief drug advisor to the UK government and a notable author on the subject of government policy and neuroscience around psychoactive drugs. David also acts as advisor to Compass Pathways and as chief research officer for Awakn Life Sciences. And in the middle next to me is Celia Morgan, Professor of Psychopharmacology at Exeter University. She also heads research into the use of ketamine in combination with psychotherapy in the treatment of addiction with Awakn Life Sciences. So I guess the purpose of this panel discussion is to separate the hype from the perhaps rather slower, grinding and uncertain reality of psychedelic psychotherapy research. I'd like to start by just sharing with you my own personal experience as a bit of a novice in this area. I did an interview with the team at UCL here in London, I think late last year. They are part of the Compass Pathways research effort looking at psilocybin for treatment of depression. And they said they had been absolutely blown away by the responses they had when they first put out requests for participants in these trials. They said they'd never seen such a strong response where they basically didn't have to chase people at all. They were overwhelmed by applicants. But that raised a huge concern, which was patient expectations. And Celia, I wonder if we could start with you. One of the biggest problems we have here is we're dealing with people who are very vulnerable, who are coming into this often as a last resort, as a treatment into these trials. And yet we know that, for instance, in the case of these particular trials, the results were 1 in 4 responded, which is good, but it means 3 in 4, it didn't work. How do you handle, in your research work with ketamine, how do you handle patient expectations?
Yeah, I think you're right, so that it's a huge problem. Can you hear me okay? Or do I need to move that? Shall I bring it here? I think you said not to do that.
Yeah, I think we'll just leave it here.
So we have people coming, and the trials I've run and the work with Awakn is treating people for alcohol problems. But these are often people at the end of their treatment life cycle, like they've tried multiple detoxes and they've tried all different kinds of treatments, and they hear about this almost miracle treatment and they come full of hope and expectation. And lots of people do respond, and we've heard some amazing stories, and people have been really courageous in sharing their stories today of the positive side of things. But also people like Ian spoke about the difficulties of relapsing and how hard that is. And I think almost the sense of hopelessness gets compounded in the patient because they feel that they've failed in this miracle treatment, and there's a kind of shame as well for not responding. When you're part of a trial, you feel like you're letting people down as well. So it is a huge problem. I think we could help by kind of changing the narrative around the substances to emphasize that people are more active participants in their recovery, to stop using the C word, the kind of cure, and talk about it more as a process. I mean, I'm a strong advocate. I guess that's if you see psychedelics as always embedded in therapy, which I do. I think that if you see it as part of a therapeutic process, then you see that the work, the psychedelic experience is part of it, but actually the work continues with the therapy, and it might be a lifelong process. And things like integration, as we heard earlier, are really important in that. So I think we can just be a little bit more moderate in the way we explain the findings to people and talk about these treatments more moderately. I mean, it's really tough because expectations change your experience.
I mean, is this a particular problem in treating depression? Because obviously, if you're coming to this as a last resort and then it doesn't work out for you, which chances are it won't, then that can presumably put you at risk of deepening the depression you're already in. Is there a solution to this?
Well, there's no solution to it other than get better at what we're doing. do it, learn more about the reasons why people fail. And there are, quite a few potential ways we could explore that. I mean, partly it's driven, and I think some of the evidence that we have, the more they've been traumatized in childhood, and Dublin was talking about that as well, the harder it may be to break the patterns of thinking. So we may need maybe different psychological interventions. We may need more treatments in order to help people who've got a more embedded kind of problem. We might be able to make measures of people's brains, as we heard, potentially from the kernel analysis, that would actually help us predict what kind of treatment might work. No one has yet done a head-to-head of psychedelic versus ketamine. Maybe different people respond to different ways. Who knows? We're at the very early days of this research. There's a vast amount more to discover. I mean, we can't answer those questions for the drugs we've had for 50 years. So don't expect us to have the solutions today for ones we've only been working with for the last 5.
So for me, it's time to get sober about psychedelics. And I think that, interestingly, there's a scientific component to this, Lawrence, but there's also a responsibility of journalists who really look to the interesting, cool story. And when we have people coming to sites from the Czech Republic to Stanford, California, saying they're here for the psychedelic cure, the psilocybin cure, and when you see, in fact, that there aren't cures, that many of the trials that have been early reported are small trials. They're done single sites, often by people who are proving that this works rather than determining whether it works. I think you have a really interesting dilemma for vulnerable patient populations where you started. So I think we all have a responsibility here to really focus on the science. We're kind of where oncology was in the early 90s. We're starting to look, just very basically look, at precision, predictive, and preventative models of care. And this is very early days for this whole new field in psychiatry.
I mean, speaking as a journalist, obviously,
that's all your fault. We want this to be interesting, don't we?
I mean, the thing that draws you in, obviously, is the spiciness of the headline. If you could put LSD or magic mushrooms or something in the headline, then that gets a lot of excitement. People have memories of what happened in the 60s. But, I mean, David, I know that the media has got your chagrin on a number of occasions by both sensationalizing and then vilifying certain psychoactive drugs. I mean, do you think the media is a problem, and how cynical do you think the media's behaviour is?
Well, you can't talk about the media as being a single entity. Well, of course, there's the BBC,
there's the BBC.
And then there's the Red Cross. But I was just reflecting on Amanda's sort of narrative about her life. I think when I do mine, I'll just put up a series of Sun headlines. Dr. Death, Professor Poison, the mad professor. So, yeah, I think the media is somewhat divided. But as most journalists say to me, it's we don't write the headlines, we just write the story, but there's some other person that writes the headlines. And I think that's probably true, isn't it? The headlines almost never reflect the content.
But do you think it's a case of educating the media better and just, I mean, my
Yes!
Speaking from personal experience, obviously I came into this thinking this is really exciting and amazing, but the more I got into the detail, the more I thought, oh yeah, actually this is a really tricky problem to handle with care, right? But do you think it is an education problem, or do you think it is just the cynicism of certain journalists who want to get a headline and don't really care?
Well, there's no question the latter is true. The former, I hope the former is also true, that there are plenty of interested journalists. And I think, again, you couldn't possibly generalize about the media. I mean, the media doesn't serve the purpose just of telling the truth. It has a much bigger agenda. But as long as the science journalists tell the truth, that's a good start.
What about investor expectations? I mean, we've obviously just had a whole discussion on this platform about that. But the thing that strikes me is, obviously we're not in an investor bubble in this area anymore, but is there a basic disconnect between the expectations of maybe some investors coming into this space thinking this is an exciting, hot area, this has great potential, and the much slower, more grinding reality of something which is ultimately dictated by the pace of regulatory approvals and which involves a lot of uncertainty and a lot of frustrations along the way? Is that because, as somebody who has to go out with the begging bowl occasionally to get investor money, what's your experience there?
So it's a little bit like the answer with media, right? So there is no such thing as the investors. There are many different kinds of investors with many different motivations. Some are here to look at social impact and involve investing in mission-driven companies for the long term. Others view that they have so much money that they have to allocate a lot of it for a long period of time. There are others who are looking at daily changes in markets. So we have all of those different forces here. We have people who may actually be very interested in improving mental health and contributing to that until they have an outsized return, which they have to take. So, I think we have a very, very broad church when we talk about investors. I think right now what's quite clear is that this is not for the faint-hearted, that cash does matter, as Christian said, that we really are going to be through this Darwinian experience right now, where companies that were able to really have substance and move forward will be the ones that will be more likely to survive.
Do you want to name any of those?
I think we've already seen a couple of those names. But I think there are also other great opportunities here, right, for investors right now. But there is no one investor. What we see is that some investors left early, some investors are doubling down right now in this process, and so it's really a really mixed bag, actually, of different motivations. There are some very large, mutual funds and so forth. We had an interesting, when we first started, we had the pension fund of the Italian doctors, the physicians, as one of the lead investors from the Italian government. So there's all these different perspectives here.
Can I just comment a bit about my sense, and being a bit an outsider to this, is that people thought psychedelics would be as easy as cannabis.
Well, there was that class of investor, right? Absolutely.
Yes. It hasn't been, and it's a much longer haul, at least in most of the world anyway.
And it's not just a drug you give to somebody and walk away, I guess, is a large part of it as well.
But
there are huge duty of care issues around this. I mean, as we've seen with MAPS, how do you deal with that? Because obviously you're taking people who, to start with, are very vulnerable, and then you're putting them into an even more vulnerable psychedelic state where they're highly suggestible. And, if you're doing large trials, there's always going to be a risk that something happens which goes awry. How do you deal with that, and how do you deal with the headline risk of that in particular?
Well, I have to say your trial was remarkable in the number of centres you used. Wade must be the biggest.
Well, that's because we wanted to see if this works in the real world, right? 22 sites, 10 countries, 7 languages, training therapists in all that area, right? And the results were remarkably consistent across that. And I think the other thing that we demonstrated was 93% of the folks who were in our trial had never had a psychedelic experience, compared to usually 40 and 50% in other prior trials. So this notion of generalizability is really important, but your point is super important in the sense you want therapists without an agenda other than to be present, to support the patient, for what the patient needs, not what the therapist believes should happen. We had an instance in one of our early trials where the therapist was actually expressed disappointment that the patient didn't have the experience that the therapist thought they should have. That's the kind of thing that you have to be super careful about, particularly when you have people who are enthusiastic about their experience as the reference experience. So you have to be really, really incredibly sober, incredibly focused on what's needed to understand that people are in a vulnerable state, and you're there for them. They're not there for you.
And of course, expectations are absolutely fundamental for the psychedelic experience itself, right? I mean, if you go into that with your expectations coloured by a therapist maybe making an offer remark, that itself can push you into a place that perhaps you don't want to be during that session.
I think you're absolutely right. One of the things we found we're still looking at data, obviously, but we're taking a model that really hasn't had evidence built around it at scale, which is the preparation, the delivery, and the integration. What's been really interesting is to see the impact of preparation as actually being deeply connected to outcomes. And so I think we really want to spend a lot of time looking at, because it is an expectation, if someone is mind manifesting wall-to-wall despair, that has one impact on outcomes as opposed to if they have an intention to make a change in their lives. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in this early nascent phase of this 21st century approach to this model of care.
Is there a problem when you... Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask you a question of George. Is that something you measured then, the preparation in your trials, and how did you index that? Because I think it's something we don't have a clear handle on. things like motivations, expectancy, and quantifying preparation. Because in my reading of the literature, there's not a lot of studies that have looked at without preparation, with integration, what's the role of these things.
You can't remove preparation in an ethical way.
Exactly. So how do we measure that? And is it like the degree of preparation or the length of preparation?
Well, I think, it's really interesting when you take transcripts and recordings and videos and put them through machine learning and start looking at patterns and shifts of narratives. Then we start being able to apply contemporary tools to understand the science of preparation rather than the folklore of preparation. And there could be a high level of correlation. We just don't know yet.
Yes.
Given the patient vulnerability, is there a problem when you bring the profit motive into this? And Celia, I'm going to put this question to you because obviously there are issues seemingly coming out now in the US with ketamine being pushed as a treatment drug there. Obviously that's a very different setup to the kind of work you're doing, but how do you see like a real tension there, that where there's too much focus on just running it as a business? And I will come back to you, George. There's too much focus on running it as a business, that the actual patient care can fall by the wayside.
Yeah, I'm not sure to my mind that it's being run as a business that's the risk. It's that it's unregulated, and as you said, the context around in which you give the drug is really important, and I think too much emphasis there has been placed on the ketamine as a medicine in a traditional medical model without thinking, about the really unique subjective state that people enter into. We wrote a paper for Lancet Psychiatry about the ethics of ketamine, I think back in 2018, and we were looking at different practices. There were people doing things like get 4 infusions, get 2 free. They're kind of marketing it like toilet roll, and it's, you're entering a different dimension. This is not the same marketing muscle that you should be applying to ketamine. So it's really, I think that that's a risky industry. Another practice that I've seen, I think from the ketamine world, that I find particularly worrying is there's a number of pharmaceutical companies interested in and looking at oral daily dosing, like oral maintenance dosing with ketamine. And I mean, it seems to people quite confusing, but I've been researching ketamine as a treatment recently, but before that I spent 10 years of my career researching the addictive properties of ketamine, and it is addictive in some people.
And it has physiological damage as well.
Physiological symptoms, and you will develop tolerance. So if you're using daily dosing, which is completely contrary to all the psychedelic medicines models, I think that's really, really risky. So, I mean, I think also that the ketamine clinics in the US are unregulated, and it's interesting to hear what George said about the way that the therapists have been trained, there were consistent results across all these different countries and centres. So I kind of think maybe we need something, clinical guidelines, or even a global clinical consensus, and patient registries as well as clinician registries to keep an eye on potential bad actors in this space.
I mean, David, do you fear moves towards deregulation? For example, I believe Oregon has now, or is in the process of lifting restrictions on magic mushrooms. Do you worry that if there is a push to deregulate, to create more commercial opportunities, that this could end up in exactly the kind of negative outcomes and headlines that resulted in the big backlash back in the 60s?
Yeah, I think it's a really key question. I mean, Oregon has obviously voted for some kind of future. It knows where it wants to be. It doesn't quite know how to get there. And if they get it wrong, they might end up finding they've created more problems than they anticipated. I mean, sort of analogy really is with Colorado and cannabis, where it was great that it was made legal, but on the other hand, a gummy bear with 100 milligrams of THC is not a good thing to have in your corner shop. So now they're pulling back. So I think hopefully the lessons of cannabis have been learned, and hopefully Oregon will set up processes like patient registry, like doctor registries or therapist registries, which minimize the risk of there being a lot of problems, and obviously, if there are problems, it's going to reflect badly on the field, so we have to monitor that very carefully.
I mean, we had a discussion about this previously where you said if governments and regulators look at the science, then it's kind of clear what the right regulatory framework should be. But what's your confidence that regulators will actually do that?
Well, one of the problems is, I don't know, someone here may know, but when Oregon goes for mushrooms being illegal and part of some kind of well-being network, I guess they're still going to be illegal under federal law. So the problem with the medical cannabis model in America is that you've got 200 million Americans having medical cannabis, and the US government isn't researching any of the outcomes. So we don't know whether it's been good or bad. And that would be, if they miss that opportunity again, then we're going to basically have another significant delay in understanding the potential utility of magic mushrooms being used for well-being. Because I think my understanding is they're not targeting mental illness in Oregon, they're targeting people that want to have an experience and feel better about things.
Mm. Another aspect of this is obviously cost, and who ultimately pays for the cost to patients in treatment, assuming these therapies do get full approval, because they don't come cheap. I mean, you're still paying for a psychotherapy session. All of the controls around that presumably come with a price tag as well. I mean, in the therapy model you're looking at introducing, George, how do you take account of that? What is your expectation? How much does that vary between jurisdictions?
Well, I think that we're right now looking at how to optimize that. So we've done models where we have one person where the FDA, without a suit, has given us the ability to work with master's level patients or therapists with patients, and and to do one-on-one rather than two-on-one. But their request has been to make sure that we record and have a record of those sessions. So should anything untoward, just pay a patient record, if you will. I think that really we have to get beyond sort of where pharma has failed. And pharma gets, charges a lot for inputs and tries to avoid taking accountability for outputs and outcomes. And I think that world is changing. And I think it's changing here, it's changing in the US in places as well. So I think what we really have to do is to look at what outcomes can we create, which means identifying which patients could benefit, which ones may not benefit, acknowledging that early so that we're not treating people who will not benefit from this. And I think that's where we were with cancer, again, 30 years ago, but now we can identify that. I think it regards how do we work with payers, how do we work with health systems to agree how are we benefiting them and how do we share in that benefit to fuel future research. So I think we have to get beyond this kind of very 20th century model of charging for inputs and really being jointly accountable for outcomes. And I think we see that in value-based models that are emerging and risk shares and so forth. So early days there, we'll see a convergence of innovation in neuroscience, but innovation in payer dynamics, innovation in health systems, and how we all align on being on the same side of the table, looking at how to improve outcomes.
I mean, I can see the argument for the NHS ultimately providing this as a free service, because obviously from their point of view there may be a bit more of an upfront cost to giving somebody an SSRI, but on the other hand, if it's successful, then you're cost-free for over the life, of that person's lifetime. You basically, for the people it works for, you've solved that problem. I just wonder, how's it going to work, for instance, in a US context where, I mean, just the cost of the drug itself, because I mean, it's part of, you have the IP for the drug you're using. How is that going to be charged in a country like the US in a way that makes sure that patient welfare comes first? Because obviously in the US we've seen plenty of drugs which are very cheap in the rest of the world being massively overcharged in a US context.
Absolutely, and I think that we have to look at these value-based models. Different payers are looking at them. The real challenge in systems like the US is that the health system or the payer rarely holds on to a patient for more than a couple of years because people will change employers, they'll get a new insurer. So we have to really look at some of these models and how they might apply in the US system. It's stuff we're working on right now, but we're not, we don't have answers yet. We have a lot of questions, but at least we're working on those questions with others, including payers.
Okay, last question for all of you, open question. Where do you see things 10 years from now?
Well, I'll be underground, but I'll be looking at the blooming flower of the psychedelic revolution.
Are you thinking about the nuclear tsunami, or
just thinking about my age?
Maybe you'll be feeding some mushrooms, maybe.
It's true. Plant them on my grave. What a great idea.
Sorry, hopefully I'll still be alive. Sorry, Dave. I think, well, from a ketamine perspective, we're really lucky. We've got our phase 3 study funded by the Department for Health here, so I hope to see, I mean, just in the work that I do, that we would have ketamine license for AUD. I hope that maybe if we continue to, not exaggerate the benefits and also not to minimise the risks, then we will just be able to keep going with this movement. Or maybe all working together, we can accelerate progress in this area. Yeah, I'd like to see regulated psilocybin and clinics where people could choose, and clinicians can choose from all of these medicines, and then those to be legal. So that's what I'd hope for in 10 years.
George,
I think that we'll see the evolution of science as we saw in oncology, where we will have a precision, a predictive and preventative model of care for certain patient groups that we can work on. Not we, Compass, but we together. And I think that one of the things that will be really important is we'll start shifting away from this notion of helping people when they're ill, but keeping people well. And I think one of the most interesting questions I like to ask of payers is, when do you stop making someone better? And I think this really points to some of the data that we've seen, which is, yes, we have reduction in depression symptoms, but look at what happens to the quality of life. The people who responded in our phase 2B trial at 25 milligrams actually live in a different world for 3 months of the measurement than those who didn't respond. They are at the same level of quality of life, well-being. They have things that they haven't experienced before, positive thoughts. And those data, I think, become really interesting in terms of how do you get people well and help them stay well? Because having people be well deals with the 10 to 15 years shorter lifespan of people with treatment-resistant depression. That's a very, very difficult situation, obviously, for the individuals, their families, but also for society. So I think this notion of predictive, personalized predictive and preventative care, moving where oncology now is, where cancer used to be a death sentence. Now look at where we are. Hopefully we'll start seeing the beginning of that in psychiatry.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.